Hey, scholars. I'm a bit of a rain delay here this morning, so I thought I'd cut a couple of quick videos. First one's going to be on strategy. And as you all know, strategy in my mind is probably the most critical thing that operation managers need to focus on a periodic basis. And as I mentioned in class, I forget the author, but one of his sayings is when you're climbing the ladder of success, make sure that it's leaning against the right wall. And I've seen many times where businesses don't have the right strategy, and that strategy drive them right out of business. My personal example was AT&T, where they just had the wrong strategy. They couldn't get out of their own way. Good people, smart people, terrible strategy. In a changing world, they couldn't change. And another example is Domino's Pizza. In the Domino's Pizza example, they had a strategy that worked great in the 80s, but it didn't work in 2000 and beyond. And the management stuck with that strategy almost to their full demise. I don't know how they figured it out in time. I guess it was that lawsuit. And they were able to make adjustments, and they're still in business. They were big enough to survive it, but a lot of businesses wouldn't. So anyways, you got to start with this overall concept of, are we doing the right things in the context of, and what do you put that context in? Context of our customers, the context of our competition, the context of our overall environment, and anything else that may come into play, legal and regulatory things, macro environmental items. I gave the example of my client out in West Texas who is in a town that is oil related and did a bang up business for the last until 2015. 7 years or so. Oil goes bust, boom, he goes bust. So what's going on? Is it a good time would it have been a good time for him to have expanded in 2015? He thought so at the beginning of the year. Honestly, I thought so too. Sure don't think so today, and nor does he. So anyway, strategy, critically important. You got to have the right people to implement that strategy, and that is, I think, number two, is if you've got the wrong people, they're going to do things like say, we don't do it that way here. We've never done it that way here. We gave a number of examples in class about strategies that have failed because the team wasn't behind them. And I gave a list of, I believe it was 7 items that I think are critical in terms of getting your team aligned around the strategy. And I'll go through those quickly here. The first was goals. They got to make sure that there's goals. Now with goals, you got to make sure that they're bought into those goals. And that means not that, okay, yeah, I'll do it, boss, because you asked me to. It means that they're fully committed to it and that they're going to create the environment necessary to deny failure. If they're not committed at that level, they're not committed. They may be giving you lip service, but you got to make sure you really got them bought into them. You got to be bought into them yourself too, by the way. You got to give them feedback, periodic feedback. Depends on the individual. Some people every day isn't too often. Some people every 3 hours isn't too often. Some people once a month is plenty. So you got to give them feedback, though. Give them recognition. You do something good, give them recognition. There's positive and negative recognition. They do something bad, they got to get thumped about it. A lot of managers don't like the thumping part of the job, but you got to do it. You got to give them both the good and the bad. Getting rid of poor performers. And I know in the military it's a little different, but the businesses I manage, I tell them all the same thing. You got to be slow to hire and quick to fire. And you got the wrong person in the job, get them out of there. They're a cancer on the organization. The poor performers always bring down the good performers. It doesn't ever work the other way. Gravity works down. It doesn't work up. And so those poor performers are going to drive your organization down. Get rid of them. You got to get rid of them. Next is you have to have clarity around that strategy. And as we've said, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but the strategy at least has to be explainable by everybody in the organization. It needs to be that clear that they can say, yeah, I get the strategy, I get where we're going, I get why we're going there, and this is what that strategy is. We have to understand the customers. So who are our customers? What are they looking for? How do we serve them better than anybody else? And the competition. What's the competition up to? And are we keeping the competition in check? And are we leading versus following? Jack Welch, when he was at General Electric, he used to say that we're going to be number 1 or number 2 in any business that we choose to go into, or we're not going to be in that business, which, and I love it. And be the best or don't be at all. And he was very, very successful at General Electric with that philosophy and that overall strategy. All right, the 10 OM decisions come into play every chapter that we've gone over so far. So you got to know those. Look at them. You're going to get questions on them probably through the course of the whole course of the course, and just make sure you know them. I'm not going to ask you to spit out all 10 of them to me, but questions like you had on the practice quiz last week would be pretty typical. The SWOT, you need to know that in terms of developing a strategy: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, of course. Michael Porter's 5 forces: the bargaining power of suppliers, the bargaining power of buyers, the competitive landscape. And in the competitive landscape, you're looking at 3 things. You're looking at new entrants, who's coming into the industry. You're looking at substitute products. What's a new product coming along that may replace the product that you have? And you're also looking at rivalry. Who are your current competitors? So Porter's 5 forces, important to understand, and understanding a strategy. And you just got to be able to do it and understand those. We talked a little bit about how do you differentiate yourself in a business environment, and there are 3 ways that we do it. You differentiate yourself on cost, on quality, and or speed. And you got to have some point of differentiation, or you're just in the pack. And if you're in the pack, you can compete on price, but that's about it, or with real expensive marketing budgets. So you got to figure out where you want to play, and you got to be able to play in a very effective fashion against the competition. Again, and using Porter's 5 forces, figure out where you are and how you take advantage of those. Talked about the product life cycle from the what do we call it here? The introduction phase, the growth phase, the maturity phase, and the decline phase. And we talked about how that cycle used to be long. Use the IBM Selectric as an example. I think had a 20-year life. A product today has a 20-year life. Commodities, maybe 2x4s. But there's very few things that have a 20-year life that are in a competitive type of a situation or position. And we talked about that life cycle being shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. So you always have to be thinking about what's next, and maybe 2 or 3 moves down the chessboard. What's next, not just for the next product, but what's the product that's going to come out 2 or 3 generations from this product. So make sure that when you're developing your strategy, you're looking at that and considering that. We talked about key success factors and KPIs, key performance indicators, and businesses having to have the ability to understand those. And we talked about the basic reports that I think are important that every business needs to know and look at periodically, some of them daily, some of them monthly. But they're the income statement, the balance sheet, the statement of cash flow, and the operations report, which is primarily where your key performance indicators are located. Key performance indicators typically are going to be ratios such as productivity. So what's the unit of output that we have versus the amount of input that we had to put into it, which would show your productivity. What's our unit cost per? What's our cost per unit? So it costs us X dollars to produce Y units, do the division, and that gives you the cost per unit. So key performance indicators are typically ratios, but not always ratios. Some of them would come right off of the income statement, or perhaps the balance sheet, more likely the income statement. So what are our salary expenses for the month? And whenever I look at them, I always look at them, what are our salary expenses versus our productivity for the month? What's our total revenue versus the total salary expenses? You get a ratio, it tells you something. If you just look at total salary expenses, you might spend $10,000 more in salaries in a particular month, but you produce 15 times as much product, which you're happy with that variance versus, just looking at spending $10,000 more, you'd think you were sad with that. So you got to get behind the numbers to really understand what's going on. Bear with me here. The theory of comparative advantage, you all need to know that. Basic theory says that if somebody's better at something than you are, then outsource it to them. Better, what does that mean? Better, faster, cheaper. They can utilize resource. What are those resources? Time, team, and money. Better than you can. And so outsource it to them, let them do it. You just stick with your core competency. as we said, as I said in class, if you have to outsource your core competency, then you got a real problem. You got to figure that out. All right, that's probably enough for strategy.